All right, good afternoon. We'll get started here. Hello, my name is Jim Duran, and you're participating in the Vanderbilt University Library's Open Mind panel discussion on informed citizenship and the economics of information. I'm the curator of Born Digital Collections and a manager of the Vanderbilt Television News Archive. The News Archive is celebrating its 50th anniversary. The News Archive records and makes available for research the evening news broadcasts of major television networks, as well as breaking news events. As part of the 50th anniversary, we're co-sponsoring tonight's event. Back in 1968, the Vanderbilt Libraries took part in an experimental project to record and preserve network broadcast news, because there was an interest in studying bias in the news. We continue that project today because television news remains an important agent in the dissemination of vital information for many Americans. The challenge we face as an archive is the ephemeral nature of television broadcasts. It isn't easy to save that much video. We hold over 55,000 hours of content. Even in the age of Netflix and Amazon Prime, news broadcasts lack the longevity as a news source. Take, for example, newspaper. Newsprint is another form of news, another news format that is not intended to be kept that long. But libraries and archives across the country take part in its preservation and have saved and made accessible for research hundreds of years of news content. With programs in microfilm and digitization, libraries have long taken part in the preservation of newsprint. So while hundreds of schools and libraries have held onto their copies of the New York Times, Washington Post, and USA Today, Vanderbilt was virtually alone in its attempt to preserve television news with the same energy. Why did Vanderbilt try to capture television news? Because Americans from the 1950s through the 1990s were glued to the television. It was the primary source for news for most Americans, and it came through the voices like Walter Cronkite, Peter Jennings, and Dan Rather, through three networks, ABC, CBS, and NBC. There was no real diversity of voices. There were no real alternative choices. But we accepted this hegemony because the news networks were relatively credible, neutral, and accurate in their reports. Plus, broadcasting was difficult to do, so there was not many people doing it. Of course, we know now fewer people are watching television news. With the rise of the internet, blogs, YouTube, and social media, we are experiencing a culture where broadcasting knowledge and information is so much easier. Now, anyone passionate enough to put themselves out there can draw a massive audience. Geographic and economic barriers are quickly diminishing for both educators and broadcasters, and audiences are selectively limiting their intake of information to what only concerns them. Our panel will explore what this means for institutions of journalism and higher education. The staff at the Vanderbilt Television News Archive is thankful to participate in these conversations as we too search for the meaning of informed citizenship and the economics of information. So now I'd like to introduce our panel moderator, Andrew Weselick, the Director of Digital Scholarship and Scholarly Communications here at Vanderbilt University.
Thank you, Jim. Do I need to be closer? Thank you, Jim. So as he mentioned, today we're here to explore the democratization and diversification of information. Every cell phone today is a video, is a news story, and every YouTube account is a classroom. Citizens no longer trust or rely on the experts for their information, partially because they can obtain first-hand accounts of the world around them. In the age of untrusted experts and folk journalism, folk education, what's the state of higher education and journalism? Is this trend a boon for our First Amendment rights? Is it the demise of informed citizenship? What's happening to our institutions, and what are the experts doing about it? And before we begin our panel discussion today, please allow me to take just a moment to express my gratitude for being asked to moderate it. My professional career has been dedicated to the opening of research and scholarship and educational materials and the advancement of disseminating those outputs in rapid, equitable, and open ways. So in thinking about the potential relationship between the openness in the scholarly space and openness in the more general information space, I began to wonder, should we, open advocates in academia, view the unintended consequences of openness in the general information space as a warning of sorts? And by this I mean the initial emergence of social media platforms combined with the increasing ubiquity of smartphones promised a golden age of information sharing where news, events, or the mundane could be spread widely, rapidly, and freely, at least in a monetary sense. And these are lofty aims and certainly goods in themselves. However, the ubiquity of information and its largely free availability has also brought serious and unintended consequences. Avoidance or outright subversion of authoritative sources of information has led to rapid spread of misinformation, the injection of conspiracy theories into our mainstream political spaces, and the formation of information bubbles, as described by Jim, even taken to the extreme, the potential weaponization of some of our social media platforms. So opening access to scholarly works similarly promises to accelerate the creation of new knowledge and provide public access to publicly funded research and to democratize access to scholarship. Certainly these are social goods that we should pursue, but if we don't learn from the unintended consequences of the democratization of information generally, and the open dissemination of scholarship bypasses those mechanisms that vet and credential that scholarship, I worry that we could potentially unleash similarly social ills. And analogous to our information bubbles in the news space, as described by Jim, I can imagine explosions, for example, of racially or politically motivated works of scholarship, further fueling existing social and political divides, or perhaps public pressure through institutional funding or pressure on federal funding agencies, resulting in restrictions on academic freedoms. Now, I don't think that these concerns should prevent us from advocating for the open dissemination of scholarship, but we would do well to ensure that open scholarship is appropriately vetted, credentialed via traditional or alternative yet robust methods. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing the thoughts of our three panelists today. And as for the general structure of this event, we'll give each panelist 5 minutes to comment generally on our topic, after which I have a series of questions to pose to the panel. After I pose that series of questions, we'll then open it up to the audience for a more engaging Q&A. And with that, please allow me to introduce our three panelists. Chaz Sisk. Chaz joined WPLN in 2015 and became an editor in 2018. Previously, he covered state politics for Nashville Public Radio and the Tennessean. He has also reported on communities, politics, and businesses for a variety of publications in Massachusetts, New York, and Washington, D.C. Chaz grew up in South Carolina and attended Columbia University, where he studied economics and journalism. Following Chaz, we'll hear from Elizabeth Shook. Elizabeth is the librarian for copyright and scholarly communications at the Jean and Alexander Hurd Library. Elizabeth's background includes an undergraduate history and master's in library and information studies, with positions at the United States Forest Service and several public and academic libraries. With a strong belief in equitable access to information, Elizabeth has worked throughout her career to remove barriers to scholarship and to ensure that everyone with an internet connection can read, reuse, innovative research. She strives to provide free and open access to information to improve the human condition. Then we will hear from Ken Paulson. Ken is a journalist, lawyer, and educator who has combined these three roles as an advocate and expert on the First Amendment. He's the president of the First Amendment Center, dean of the College of Media and Entertainment at Middle Tennessee State University, and the former editor of USA Today, where he remains a columnist writing about First Amendment issues. Ken is widely known for developing creative approaches to teaching the First Amendment, including a musical stage show called Freedom Sings, the social media campaign Free to Tweet, and the Emmy-honored national television show Speak Freely. He's also the host of The Songwriters, seen in more than 100 cities on PBS stations nationwide. With that, we'll begin with Chaz, and again, each panelist has 5 minutes to generally comment on our topic, and then we'll follow that up with Q&A.
All right, thank you very much. So there's a lot of academic topics we're going to be talking about today, which is not really my specialty, being in public radio. But first of all, I just want to talk a little bit about what I do have firsthand knowledge of, which is public radio and journalism in general. As Andy said, I'm a senior editor at National Public Radio at WPLN, which means that my main responsibility is making sure that the information that goes on the air and on our website is fair, accurate, and complete to the extent possible. Of course, we have to deal with deadlines, and there often are things that we don't know, and we don't know, but we always are trying to get it as right as possible in real time. Now, most of you probably know the model of public radio is that we are not government funded. We are primarily funded by our community. 93 to 94% of our funding at Nashville Public Radio comes from individual donors and corporate underwriters here in Nashville. And we pay for the programming that you hear on WPLN. If the news programming, like All Things Considered and Morning Edition, we purchase that from NPR. And the programming like Marketplace, This American Life, we purchase from other organizations like American Public Media and Public Radio International. So it's a very bottom-up approach to funding. And the reason this is important is, in a lot of ways, we work like commercial television, not like a newspaper chain where ownership is maybe somewhere else, but ownership is in the community, at least since we are a local nonprofit. And the signal is locally owned, and the programming comes from the network. Now, one way in which we are very different from those big three networks that used to do that still do the nightly newscast, but used to be so hegemonic, as you said, is that a lot of what we do is that in public radio at NPR, a lot of the programming is from the local level up. You know, when All Things Considered or Morning Edition or Marketplace they have an expectation that we will provide some of the stories that appear on their air. Most recently, we had a story about the libraries here, about the news archive that appeared just late last week on, I believe it was on All Things Considered. So that's something that is very different from ABC News or CNN or Fox, the way that they've always worked through the years. And the reason for this is that NPR understands that we know our communities better than they know them. So we will know them much better than a journalist that's parachuting into an area. And even when one of their national correspondents comes to Nashville, they'll often work in partnership with us to help them tell the story, either by doing some of the reporting or just maybe advising them as they do their reporting. The second way in which we differ from the television model is that we're a nonprofit, so the money that is put into public radio does go into public radio. And the result of this is that there's a very high level of trust in public radio. We're consistently ranked as one of the most trusted news sources out there, usually up there with PBS and the Associated Press, which are also organizations that also work very much at the local level. The Associated Press is fed by individual reporters, individual newspapers, and PBS, of course, the local stations. And we also have a very broad reach as a result of this. Often conservatives will tell me in a confessional whisper that they're listeners, and we tell them they're in good company. There's a lot of people like them who are listening and maybe not telling their friends, but they tell us. And one of the things that we know from our research is that the thing that most indicates your likelihood to listen to public radio is your education level. It's not necessarily your partisan leanings. Which I think is, we see that as a reflection of the fact that we're fulfilling our mission to do those things, to be accurate, to be fair, and to be complete. But also shows that people who value information will ultimately turn to news sources that they can trust, and there is a level of trust that is developed. And that even in an age like this where you can get information from anywhere, it's ultimately up to news organizations to help sort through that information and be the people who can help you understand what information is truly accurate. I think it also shows that there is still a very high demand for unbiased information out there because, for one thing, our station is growing as people turn to us more and more to provide that kind of service of sorting through the information. But they do want it to be close to the source, which I think is something that is in common with the citizen journalists, is they just want it to be as close to the ground as possible. They want to know that the people who are providing it are motivated by truth and not some sort of corporate or individual or some hidden motive, I should say. Corporate ownership is not always a bad thing, but it certainly does cause people to have a little bit more skepticism when there's a profit bias. And they also want it to be fair, and I think that's something that we, like I said, try to do. So when those expectations are satisfied, people will tune in, they will turn to news organizations, and they'll pay for it, even when they don't have to pay for it. So that's my perspective on a lot of these questions.
Can you all hear me? Good. Okay. Well, thank you for having me. So I am the librarian for copyright and scholarly communications, and as Andy said in my biography, I'm very committed to opening information. Obviously, being a librarian, when I say opening information, I mean more that academic scholarship should not be end up behind a paywall and become inaccessible for everybody. At $35 a pop for an article, that's pretty inaccessible. So my job is to open up this research that is often publicly funded. I hesitated a bit with this topic because it does have the leanings of news information, and I thought about this quite a bit in terms of things that Andy actually alluded to. You know, the rise of like conspiracy theorist blogs and stuff like that. But I find all information to be valuable, and quite honestly, I'm very excited about the rise of folk journalism and folk education to provide the multiple viewpoints that we so desperately need. Real citizens, in my opinion, now have the opportunity to drive the narrative in all of their neighborhoods rather than having it be driven for them. We don't have ABC, CBS, and NBC telling us what we should think every night. Now, we check our phones, we check the internet, we have a plethora of news sources. But that comes with its own problems. As a librarian, I can tell you my number one priority, especially now, is to arm folks with a toolkit to assess whether the information they are accessing is legitimate, or at least, you know, who funded it, who is telling this story, and why are they telling it. This is basic information literacy, and it's become very apparent, especially with, I mean, we all know the stories of Facebook and data privacy and, you know, the possible tampering with our elections, that it's become more important than ever to arm folks with this toolkit. But going back, I do think it's really important that people can control the narrative of their own neighborhood. I think about how we all have these now, and we can all report on abuses of power or, you know, great moments in power too. And I think that this is a real boon to news information these days. And we're seeing that it's not as whitewashed and, you know, traditionally discriminated against groups are able to control how they are talked about in the news. And this all goes back to open access, too. I want open access for all scholarship and, I guess, for all news sources. And going to the folk education piece of this, I find it really exciting as somebody who's part of the generation that's strapped with a horrific student debt load, that I can get real-world workforce talents for free online. I'm very excited about this. But I think that's another caveat that we have to give to all of this, is that much like we librarians arm our communities with this toolkit to assess information, perhaps we need to arm them also to assess their education. Again, I really struggled with this topic because it has so many moving parts. But anyway, those are my thoughts.
So I work the vineyards of the First Amendment most of the time, and just want to offer a few thoughts about that in the context of the broader conversation. First of all, though, I want to tell you how honored I am to be here as part of the celebration of the television archives. It is an amazing resource, and everyone in this room who's played a role in that, thank you for that. It's a fabulous resource for Vanderbilt, but it's a fabulous resource for the nation, too, and we thank you for that. I don't think there's any question that what we see now, in which everyone with an iPhone or well, you name it, any vehicle for collecting thoughts and sharing them with others, every social media platform, that this is exactly the fantasy the Founding Fathers would have had, in which everyone has a voice, every idea can be shared, and that, in theory at least, and we're kind of failing the test, if we all collectively have a voice, we'll reach wiser decisions and live in a more peaceful time. Something's gone wrong. We need to re-examine that theory. But there's no question that if the Founding Fathers were alive today, that James Madison would be an inveterate tweeter. Thomas Jefferson would undoubtedly have a podcast. And Ben Franklin would be all over the porn sites. Just no question about that. Ben liked a good time. I also, when you look at education, there's no question the boon this has been. And when I talk to incoming students at our college about how media changed so quickly and how what they will experience in their careers will be dramatically different from what I did. But I always talk about my young education. I'm a child of the 60s. And, you know, if I had an assignment to write, to identify state capitals, and I desperately needed to know what was the capital of Alaska, what would I do? Well, if you're part of a Midwestern family like I was, you would go to the one bookshelf you had, and somebody had bought an encyclopedia over time at a grocery store, and the first one was always 39 cents, and then that would be the letter A, and then there'd be a B for $1. And then most families, they would just have A, B, and C. And then that would be it. So, but I'm okay, because Alaska would be in the A volume, and I would go to that and look for it, but no, that would have been published in 1958. You know, families didn't update encyclopedias, and I'd have no insight. So I'd have to get on my bike, ride 2 miles to the library, go to the room where atlases were stored, ask for some help getting the one off the top shelf, and ride home. It would be an hour experience to find out what today's generation can find out in a millisecond. It's obviously better today. There is information at their fingertips, literally at their fingertips, that would have taken so much more time to collect and take in. So it's absolutely been a boon to information, the sharing of opinions, and education on many levels. Where I get nervous about the topic of today's discussion, and these are actually new phrases to me, folk journalism and folk education, that's new to me. And I'm extremely leery of it. With all due respect, I don't think ABC, CBS, and NBC ever actually tried to tell you what to think. And if they go away, along with CNN, MSNBC, and yes, Fox, what you will have there in the universe of media will be exactly what you get in your local television stations, which is, as you all know, in some order, accidents, shootings, the weather, and how bad the Titans are. That's what local television stations cover. So folk journalism makes me nervous, like entrusting, to me, I don't want to entrust my life to folk medicine. I don't want to entrust my democracy to folk journalism. I'll get off the high horse now. Back to you.
So I should say that I think we're in agreement on that point. That the concern here is that we're in an age of information ubiquity, but then the question is how do we filter that out so that we're making sure that we have access to the information that we need, and I think that provides a good segue into this first question, which is. We've made clear, we all agree that there's a plethora of information, maybe too much information, but the question is, do citizens have access to the information that they need to make informed decisions? and what role do dominant traditional subscription-based business models and emerging like data-driven targeted advertising models play in access to and consumption of that information? And I think you're getting a little bit to that point in kind of imagining a world where there is no kind of large media and it's fractionalized. So then the question is, I guess, do we have that information that we need to make informed decisions currently and going forward? And I pose that to the panel generally.
Well, I would say no, we don't have that information, but it's honestly on us and not any other force. I mean, you think about votes on, think about the transit mess in Nashville and the strong debate over the plan that ended up just collapsing. I saw a lot of people with great passion on that topic. Very few of whom had a grasp on really what it involved. They were not big on facts and figures. There was always a broader argument about spending too much or abandoning the city to congestion. It all came to very simplistic things. But the truth is, as a society, we do not sweat the details the way we once did. And in a city council meeting in Nashville in 1965, I'll bet you would have seen 70 or 80 citizens there. And now there may be, well, it depends on the issue, what they're angry about. But in terms of people just wanting to watch the process of democracy, there's nobody there. And we put it on television so people can choose not to watch it there either. For whatever reason, there's been a shift in the American mindset. One of my pet desires is to have every job interview begin with, "So Bob," or Meredith, "what do you think about what's happening downtown these days?" Or what do you think is the most important news story in Nashville? And show that they have a grasp of current events, that it's important to know about your community. And I don't think that happens. But if they did that, if every job interview began with that, suddenly students would be buying newspapers. We would solve that crisis overnight. So my broader point really is that we get the information we deserve and demand. And if people said, you know, I really want to know about sewer permits and I want a lot more information about salaries and what we're giving to businesses to move to town, we would get that. But unless we actually ingest it, it doesn't make a difference. So I don't know what the solution to that is, but we are gossip hungry, we are story hungry, we are entertainment hungry, we're not data hungry, and we're not current events hungry, unless it's something resembling a wrestling match. So.
I respectfully disagree.
And the wrestling match begins.
So I'll admit it, I am a Redditor. How many of you are familiar with Reddit? Okay. Often on the Nashville Reddit, they are discussing these issues that you are talking about. And yes, I'm angry about transit. I'm sure the whole city's angry about transit. That's what they're discussing. But often, what I have seen is they will share articles from the local news stations, often the Tennessean, who locks their stuff down, and somebody will copy and paste the entire text into the string so people can access it. This goes to a broader argument in my career where, again, articles are, on average $35 if you don't have a subscription. So no, I don't think people have the information that they need, especially when local news organizations like the Tennessean, like it or hate it, is locking down a lot of their information from citizens. But citizens are pretty good at finding a way around it. So.
Well, I was going to agree with you on this. Until you make the analogy of a $35 journal article and a 35-cent Tennessean article. I think that I agree with you that people do still crave information. They do still, to the same extent that they ever did, do want to know what's going on in their community. I would posit that the reason you had 70 or 80 people in 1965 at the council meeting is because there were fewer options of other things to do. There was no professional sports in Nashville. There was no cable television. There was really many fewer options in terms of entertainment. I think the reason that a lot of people used to read the newspaper cover to cover is there was really not a lot of other reading material in their home on a daily basis. You know, people subscribed to the paper and they took what they were, mainly they were captive audiences for the most part. So they had to choose. Now, these days, they can choose whatever they want. They can go online, they can read anything. The downside to that is that a lot of that content is free, and nobody charges any money at all for that content, and so people don't properly value the information that has been reported out, you know, through journalism. You know, I used to work with the Tennessean, and I will say one of the things that used to upset me the most were people who would take our articles and post them online in full, because I would spend 3-4 days on something and someone would say that's not worth anything, and that's really not a fair way to be. The cost of a Tennessean subscription is actually fairly low, I think. It's very, very reasonably priced. At least they try to make it very reasonably priced. You know, not everyone can do what we do at public radio, where we just sort of say, you know, it's free, pay us what you like. There are some downsides to that, is that, you know, it's, we certainly can't have the staff that the Tennessean used to have. You know, they used to be able to be at every meeting and to cover everything in the community, and they really can't do that anymore because people don't want to pay for that. They have other options. They would rather turn to, you know, a gossip site, or, you know, and I think that's the way people have always been. People's appetite. There's some people who are highly motivated to engage in their community, and they will always do so. And there are some people who are less motivated to engage their community, and they will find ways to fill their time other ways.
If we could just continue this celebration of respectfully disagreeing.
Okay.
Let me ask this. I mean, I respect where you're coming from. I want to believe people care as much about local government and their communities as they once did. But that doesn't explain why newspapers are in free fall and why the lowest rated pages on the Tennessean's website have to do with civic issues. There's a rare example of the metro, of the fight over the fairgrounds and those things. But by and large, Tennesseans decide not to cover those things. To PLN, I give the greatest credit to. Without the distraction of visuals, you're able to report in depth and well on a lot of issues. I honestly don't, and I wasn't here in '65, and you may not have been on the planet in '65, but I think in 1965 the citizens of Nashville knew who their mayor was, and I would be surprised if 75% of Nashvilleians knew Mayor Briley's name. But I want you to be so right.
Well, as I said, I think a lot of it has to do with just the number of options has just exploded for people. You know, they have so many places they can go. You know, even when they go online, the local paper is just one of a million places they could end up, and so a lot of people, you know, do end up other places, I think.
I wonder if, just to dive slightly deeper into this before we move on, you know, we like to set this up as if you pay for newspaper and the other information is free, and thus people gravitate to the free information. But, you know, I would like to kind of pose this question to all of you. Information clearly has value. I think we all agree on that, but we might agree that it's not all of equal value. And how we determine the value and how we determine what we pay for it in non-monetary terms is really interesting, right? So on the face of it, we might say, well, okay, so there's free, and by free I mean I don't have to pay money for this article, but what else am I paying for it? And I can imagine paying for it in terms of data, like in how you're interacting with it, or even in terms of attention, right? And like both of those things are finite in nature, but I don't know that we necessarily recognize them as being finite things that we can give to someone else or some other entity. So I'd just like to kind of throw that out there about like how are we actually paying for information that comes across as free, and what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I will tell you that today when I was writing up my notes, I was writing them in Google Docs, in Google Chrome. I have a Google phone. At home I have Google Internet. I use Google all the time. So Google pretty much owns me. I use Google Maps. They know everywhere I go. I'm sure they hear every conversation. I mean, truly, so I know how I'm paying for it. And I know that that's how I'm paying for it with targeted advertising and everything else. Does that change my behavior? It hasn't thus far, but I know that's a true problem.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I mean, I also used Google Docs to draft my notes for this meeting, and used Google Maps to come over here and to find out where the Herd Library was. So that's an excellent point in terms of the privacy that we give up when we go into these, when we go online and we find information online. But I think the most important thing is time. That's the most important resource that we have. And as I said, when you have more options on how to spend your time, some people will choose to spend less of that time seeking out credible information.
I'm good.
Well, the pivot to education. Citizens can educate themselves for free with the rise of MOOCs, massive open online courses. Open journals, information like Wikipedia sources and other kind of free open sources. Can this type of self-directed education, though, be comprehensive in nature? Is teaching and learning in a shared physical space necessary?
I was really excited about this question. So first off, is teaching and learning in a shared physical space necessary? As a master's online student, I say no. However, there are a lot of benefits to sharing a space with your peers. The other part of this question that I really wrestle with, whether this self-directed education can be comprehensive, I find that really interesting because we don't know what we don't know, right? But then again, as you alluded to, I can look up what I don't know in a millisecond. I don't know what that means for the future of education, but I do know that I've learned a lot of skills from completely free resources, and they help me every day on my job. So.
Yeah, it's this is a question that obviously, being in journalism, is not one I deal a lot with in terms of academia, in terms of MOOCs and that sort of thing. Which can you define for people who may not know what that stands for? Because I couldn't remember what the acronym stands for myself.
Sure, it's massive online open course. So courses through sites like Coursera, which you can get entire semester-long courses that are produced oftentimes at universities and made freely available online in the form of like video lectures, for example.
Yeah, and I have to agree that there are a lot of benefits to being in a physical space with people, with your peers. That's the main thing I think most of us get out of our college education. It's not necessarily what we learned in the classroom. But I thought it was funny that you mentioned the World Book Encyclopedia here earlier, because when I was thinking about this, that's the exact analogy that came to my mind was, and even going back further to the great book series that Collier's put out with the Harvard brand on it back, 1910, 1920, somewhere in there, where the idea was that you could purchase these books, you could have a shelf at your home, and you could learn everything that you can learn at Harvard University. And of course, it's not 100% true, but you could learn the same facts at least. And I think that's there's been a democratization of that information over the last, since the printing press, really. I mean, and probably even going back further than that. And I think MOOCs are, to some degree, they continue that, but there are limitations to what they can do. And just speaking specifically about Wikipedia, which I kind of put in a different category because it's a resource you can call on. I use Wikipedia in what I do. And that's because it's got a very high accuracy rate. It's the studies have been done on this, and for stories, for articles that have been edited extensively, because they do have some people that they've identified as being credible editors who they prefer over any other person who goes in and changes things. Those credible editors give them a very high accuracy rate. It's as high as just about any kind of encyclopedia that you might find out there. So. It's what's happened online and digitally is that there has been an expansion of something that really goes back, centuries, really, in terms of democratizing information.
Talking about MOOCs kind of changes the parameters of the question because the scope of it. And the most remarkable thing in terms of learning in 2018 is just the specificity of our online resources. That you can be watching Netflix and the screen goes dark and beeps intermittently, and you go to your cell phone and type Netflix, beeping intermittently. And you will find 6 helpful videos on that. And so, of course, in that regard, it is an amazing teaching tool, and I don't need to be in the room with anybody else who has the same beeping problem. I just want that one-on-one. So skills, learning to play guitar, cooking, baking, all those things, that is an amazing educational tool. Where we all wonder out loud, and as a dean of a college, I give this a lot of thought, why are we building another building? Do we need another building? Will there be people here 20 years from now? Or will this all be digital delivery? And and I think technology could permit us to have as rich an experience from our living room, especially if you begin to get into the ability to kind of populate that living room with other students. If you have kind of hologram kind of quality to it, who knows what's available. So I think anytime you're self-motivated, the current environment is amazing and wonderful and a blessing. My problem is that, I don't know, 3 days out of 5, I walk into classrooms with a significant percentage of my students who are not motivated. And only by physically having them in the room do I feel like I can wrap my arms around them and say, no, really, this is important. Focus on this. And so to me, and also issues involving, a shared experience or exchanging ideas or debating political science, for now, it really needs to be in the same room. So I honestly believe the way things have always gone is cheap wins out. Cheap beats quality in our culture, always has. And so I think you'll be able to get a degree in this country a decade from now that will be respected and will allow you to be employed, and it will cost you a fraction of what you just won't be able to go out for the football team. But that's right. But Madden football you could do from your home. Anyway, so your question is a great one, and I think there are golden days ahead for education, but only when the learner wants to learn.
It's really interesting that, tying this back to your original comment, it makes me think if only we could take attendance at City Hall meetings, right?
Yeah, that's right.
We're in this golden age of information ubiquity, if only we can get people to care about it, right? In this
Right.
way.
We should offer a tax cut for attending city council meetings. Problem solved.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think that online is great for teaching facts. It's great for teaching skills. Over the weekend, my wife learned how to work a Rubik's Cube, which was, my son has had a Rubik's Cube. He's been playing around with it, and I went online to look to see how you solve a Rubik's Cube, and it is impossible to figure out. I've wanted to know since the 80s. My wife had the same questions. She spent 5 hours on Saturday figuring it out, and I can now solve it in about 15 minutes with the instructions in front of her. She can't do it on her own. But I think there's a limit, though, to what you can learn without the peer-to-peer conversations. I think that's where the real learning, the critical thinking comes in, and that's where you really get the skills you need to really sort through all the information that's out there.
I have 4 more questions remaining, but I do want to make sure that the audience has time to engage as well. So we can go ahead and take questions from the audience and proceed that way. If there are any, I would just ask, Jim, are we being recorded, or is enunciation okay on the part of our audience members? Do they need a mic? They do. Okay.
Or you can repeat the question.
Okay. I'll repeat the question. Are there questions? I'm happy to repeat them. Yes.
How many search engines do each of you have on your computers?
How many search engines do each of you have on your computers?
Well, unfortunately, the only one I use is Google. So they get all my searches, unfortunately.
I'm a little nervous to answer this because our director is in the room, but it's Google. But I do use the library catalog regularly.
I have 4, but I think Google's by far the superior. It's just sometimes when you are opening enough windows, it's helpful to have one of them be a Microsoft browser just to go back and find the window you're looking for. But Google's king.
I use Google, but I also have Foxfire and
Oh, wow. That's old school. Duck, duck. I remember Alta Vista.
I remember Nexus Lexus,
Oh, yeah.
Westlaw.
How about CompuServe?
Pardon?
How about CompuServe?
Yes, I had CompuServe. I worked for a municipality and I used the city attorney's Nexus Lexus account. And my job was to monitor state and federal regulations as they affected waste management.
Interesting. I think we had one in the back, and then,
I was reminded of in novel Fahrenheit 451, when you said you can learn things from the comfort of your own living room on screens all around you. And I remember, and then you said, do we always go to the cheapest common denominator? I think we always go to the stupidest common denominator. So how can we, I mean, the idea of the informed citizen is so important to inculcate in our students so that they will seek out something better than the whatever that was on the walls in Fahrenheit 451, those turgid dramas on the walls. We still have a role as educators to make sure people try to make themselves better. Or at least think something beyond.
sure. So how do we inspire our students to avoid situations where we're teaching to the lowest common denominator or just making things as easy as possible online?
Again, I did my degree online, and it was a traditional degree through Wisconsin. It just happened to be online. But I see a lot of the MOOCs are requiring this sort of back and forth amongst your peers and with the professors who teach these MOOCs. And I think I do think that's key to engage with your peers and your professors because they are the experts. Obviously, librarians are important too, so keep us around.
I just, I'm normally an upbeat person. This whole topic bums me out. It's, to use a phrase from the 60s. One of the challenges we have, even at Middle Tennessee, and I've seen it, I've taught law school at Vanderbilt as well, is students come in without an understanding of the world, the community, the systems. Civic education has been in steady decline. And I worry that they don't have the I think we have to turn out citizens in addition to students. And it just feels like it comes, by the time they get to our door, it's too late. And I do a lot of speaking on campuses and sometimes parents groups, and one of the things I urge people to do if they've got young children is what for dinner and why for dessert. That if at least one time a week at dinner, if you can get everybody together, discuss what happened this week. And this should happen when they're 4 and 5 and 6. And I tell you, I really bored my children. And screwed my son up so much he became a newspaper reporter. So, but then once you've told them the current events, here's what happened this week, then take a few minutes to talk about why people of good faith could disagree about that. That the world is full of different opinions, and here's what one side says, and here's what the other side says, and what do you think, Timmy? And just make sure that understanding that in a free society, all views can have some merit, and it's not just about what mom and dad think. One of the things that disturbs me now is I used to love to debate. I mean, just over a beer, talk to somebody in a spirited way about a topic. But what we all know, depending on who you're sitting next to, our country is so full with enmity and ignorance that when you have any topic, let's just think about global warming, it very quickly becomes, yes it is, no it isn't. And there are no subtleties, no shades of gray, it's just that. And if we happen to agree, what we agree on is that the other side's really stupid. We don't have a quality of public discussion we once had, and I think it's because we're not teaching a new generation to navigate different opinions in a respectful way. Here's a great hope. I have a 6-year-old granddaughter who came home one day, and she said, "Do you know what an opinion is?" And I said, "I have a pretty good idea." she said, "You know, that's when someone tells you what they believe, and then you say to them, 'Well, thank you for sharing your opinion. Here's how I see it.'" And she's 6, and it was like, I want to buy that teacher a car. That is so good, and we need to make that part of everyone's primary education, because by the time they get to our campus, they've made up their mind.
Can I ask you, do you think that this is a current problem, or students now, or just like students in the past?
I think it's been a steady decline in awareness of current events. I think fewer homes actually have a newspaper in them. And I think families are stressed for time. I mean, the notion of getting 4 members of that family at a table for a leisurely dinner and no one looking at a screen, I think is a real challenge. I mean, you hear this from parents a lot. But I also think the famous book, 2002, Bowling Alone, that's almost 2 decades ago now. This has been a trend that's been coming, but it doesn't mean it has to continue. And I do think there's a way to tap into the next generation, hopefully teach the next generation to think critically and care about their communities, and not try to instill it after they've had a chance to cast their first ballot.
Do we have a question?
Yes, this week the Wall Street Journal had an article on the emerging technology to generate audio or video of anyone doing anything. I want to know if that concerns you, and if so, how would you prepare people for an era where fake evidence and video can be created so easily?
That's a great question. So the question is, the technology is clearly emerging that allows really robust video and audio editing to make fake news that appears very real in an audiovisual nature. So how do we react to that?
Well, yes, I'm very concerned about that. I will say, first of all, that I think part of the problem with the rise of fake news in general is that people, for whatever reason, have forgotten the old adage, don't believe everything that you read. It seemed like such common sense that you wouldn't just believe something because it was on a website. I think that perhaps there was an expectation of credibility when something is published that came when the barriers to publishing were very high, in the 50s or in the 50s and 60s, where to get on television, you had to be a broadcaster, you had to have a broadcast license, you had a requirement that you be fair and balanced and those kind of things. And so perhaps that created an expectation among people that if it was out there, then it had been vetted in some way. I think that gradually our society, that's one of the things that I think our society is struggling with, is grappling with the idea that most things that they may see out there, or a large portion of what they see out there, is just not credible. And so I think audio and video, that's been one of the few things that have been difficult to manipulate, and so people still have a very high belief in those things as being accurate, and they're going to have to not only not believe what they read, but also not what they see and hear. And I think that sort of puts more, that sort of puts more responsibility on people who, journalists to sort through what's accurate and what's not accurate, and not fall into those same traps just because we see a video to believe that that's what it was. I know, for instance, just last week we had a debate in our newsroom about whether to report on a video that had been put out about a political campaign, and our response was, well, this organization is not credible. We don't know in what ways that they've been known to manipulate, to edit videos in ways that are deceptive. And so even if we say that they're misrepresenting who is speaking, we don't know that they've accurately represented what was said. So there's really no way, the best thing to do here is just to steer clear of this video completely. And hopefully people, that's a skill that everyone's going to have to a large degree in the future.
And just as an aside, the danger is twofold. People will believe fake videos, but then they won't believe the real thing. And that's really dangerous.
Well, I think we saw that with, I mean, there are a lot of people who disbelieve the Trump video with the Access Hollywood video. You know, he's actually started to say that that video maybe was manipulated in some way and it wasn't really his voice. So, yeah, I mean, there is a danger there. I think it does make it hard for any person, including journalists, to really know what's accurate and what's not. Yes.
Yeah, I guess these are a couple of comments as much as questions, but it's interesting to me that there was some talk early on about sort of the analogous roles of the university as an institution and media, news media as an institution, and a trusted one, I think. And it occurs to me, what's being lost is, for example, in the original comments about the TV News Archive being created, which I treasure. I mean, I think it's a wonderful thing. When I worked at Vanderbilt, I tried to have people do more stories about the value of the News Archive. But sitting here and hearing that it was created because people were interested in studying bias, whether there's bias in the media, the truth is, as I understand it, that there was one arch-conservative alumnus who was really pissed off about coverage of the 1968 Democrat Convention and the police response to it in Chicago. And that I think he was probably a very intelligent guy, and he just was determined that somebody proved there was bias in the media coverage. And fortunately, for all of us, that somehow that got to somebody at Vanderbilt who said, well, let's set up a study. And there was rigor, and there was gatekeeping, and there were sort of standards brought to bear on processing this knowledge. And what resulted, probably not too smoothly, was the creation of the archive, which economics kept threatening the archive for quite a while. They still do, I don't know. But John Lynch, your predecessor, was one of those guys who, unassuming as he was willing to speak truth to power. And, you know, I had a city editor in the late 60s when campus riots were going on who taught everybody who carried a press card, not that you had any right to distort the news or anything, but that you had a right to ask questions. I quickly realized later in life that I had that right without the card, to the great annoyance of many people since. But there's something that's been lost. I'm not sure that everybody who's processing news content really appreciates what the threats and how they can take over things. So the other thing I'll add, and I came here seeking answers, but having modest expectations, you know, that for 10 years after I went straight, I went back to journalism, after 10 years in D.C. as a lobbyist and public affairs and all the rest of it. I've been doing a news site that is valued by business people because they can do deals, they can make money reading it. And yet I have no way to earn significant money off of it, partly because of the bind you're in as a publisher, that you need eyeballs. And not to get too technical because I'm totally incompetent with the technology, but if you're going to get that content indexed, there's a limit to how much of a barrier you can put between the would-be reader and the content. And so you can attempt to do it, but without going into details, if you're sitting there and you've got 4 search engines and 4 different browsers, you can have my free reads all month long. I mean, you can just keep going, dumping your cookies and all that kind of stuff. That's a digital reference, by the way. You know, and so it's really frustrating. And thanks to my 3 adult kids, I'm really kind of just going with the flow. But I know that some people are making money and still having the journalistic rigor. And I actually thought there might be a bit more, you know, talk about economics in this. But I realize that's probably neither welcome nor practical. But I really appreciate you doing this. I hope you'll do more on it because it bumps me out a lot too. That's why I came down here instead of finishing that story out of workshop. And So do more, and, you know, I just hope you'll keep us posted. I hope there'll be more. I think the News Archive is a great platform for that kind of thing.
If I could, thank you, Milt, for that. I share an observation about that. You know, that's kind of the hidden story about, we talk about everybody can have a voice and everybody can be a journalist, but it turns out everybody can't be compensated for it. When I left USA Today, I was determined to learn how to build a website, run a website, handle social media, strictly a hobby. And so it's called Americana Music News, and Americana music is a subset of country and folk. And it do pretty well. I have 45,000 unique visitors a month, and record companies send me CDs, and occasionally someone will let me into a show for free. And after 7 years, I'm making in the low two figures annually. A good year would be about $14 in revenue. And because Google ads, I don't know if you know, those little ads that pop up, they pay you fractions for letting you.
I say dozens of dollars a month.
Yeah. Well, you're doing far better than I am. I'm coming to you for tips. But so that's not unusual. And so what you find in this information economy now is that overwhelmingly all those cool websites that are out there, with rare exceptions, are run by hobbyists, people who just have so much fun and they care deeply about Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and they're going to have the very best Buffy rerun website. And there's a lot of amazingly good content out there, and I hope it continues forever. But that's how fragile the economy is. People who are making money are very, very large. They're able to scale big time. But for the most part, all those websites you visit for fun or entertainment or for history, Civil War websites, almost all of them are people just enjoying it. And if they clear $200 a year and pay for their internet access, they're just delighted. I hope that continues, but it's not a great way to build an information infrastructure for the future.
Are there any final questions before we continue the discussion over refreshments?
Could I just add then, if, this thing about people paying for information that helps them do deals. I worked 4 years from 2010 to 14 for a division of the Financial Times called Merger Market and I did full-time M&A reporting. Some of the financial houses subscribing to that have hundreds of people reading it and immediately acting on this actionable data, intelligence, are paying over $1 million a year. These are global firms. And that's going to lead to a gated community around different news domains. Probably already has. And that is incredibly undemocratic.
I guess to add to that, my job is specifically in academic publishing. These professors are writing incredible amounts of research and signing away their copyright, and then the universities are buying that research back at the tune of millions of dollars. I mean, our subscriptions are out of control. And do those professors, those researchers see any of that money? No, but the publishers are, they're posting profit margins above Apple, above Google. I mean, it's incredible, and it is absolutely gatekeeping. So that is my job, to bust down these paywalls.
I respectfully agree.
Thank you.
Well, with that, thank our panelists, please. And again, we do intend to continue the discussion. We have refreshments in the back, so please stick around and join us.
You did a great job.
So did you.